The dog wasn't supposed to survive the night. That's what the vet in Tofino said, anyway. A small woman with silver-streaked hair and hands steadier than most surgeons Marsh had ever worked alongside. She'd looked at the animal on her table, barely 8 weeks old, ribs pressing through fur like fingers through paper, and said the words quietly, the way people say things they've already made peace with. He probably won't make it to morning. Marsh had driven 3 hours in the rain to hear that. He stood there in his jacket, still wet from the coast road, and looked at the puppy on the stainless steel table, black and tan. One ear folded the wrong way, eyes sealed shut, twitching at something only he could see. Marsh didn't say anything for a long time, then he said, "Do what you can." He paid for a week up front and drove back to the cabin alone. That had been 5 days ago. Now he was standing at the same table again, and the puppy's eyes were open. The cabin sat at the edge of a logging road outside of Ucluelet, on Vancouver Island's west coast, where the trees are so old and so tall they make the sky feel like a suggestion. Marsh had bought it 3 years back, after he came home and realized he didn't know what home meant anymore. The previous owner had been a fisherman who died at 81 with no heirs and no apologies. And there was something about that life, uncomplicated, worn smooth by salt and silence, that appealed to Marsh in a way he couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't spent 15 years doing what he'd done. His full name was Douglas Marsh, 44 years old. Retired from the Naval Special Warfare Command before he should have been, which is the military's way of saying the exit was not entirely voluntary. He didn't talk about the specifics with anyone on the island, and no one pushed. People on the west coast of Vancouver Island understood something that people in cities had mostly forgotten. Some things don't need to be explained. You could see enough just by looking. He was big in the way of men who had been bigger and hadn't entirely gone so soft. His hands were marked in several places. He walked with the slight deliberateness of someone who had learned, the hard way, to be aware of what was behind him. The woman at the grocery store in town, Janet, had asked him once if he'd been in the military, and he'd said yes, briefly, and she'd nodded and handed him his change, and that had been the end of it. He'd come to the island because of Juno. Juno had been his wife's name. She was from Whitehorse originally, which is where the name came from, and she had found it embarrassing in a way she found secretly charming. She'd been a nurse. She'd had brown hair and a laugh that filled whatever room she was in, and she had loved him in the particular way that strong women sometimes love difficult men. Patiently, honestly, without illusion. They had been married 11 years when she was diagnosed. 14 months after the diagnosis, she was gone. That had been 4 years ago now. He didn't talk about her either. But her photograph was on the mantel above the fireplace, and every morning he made 2 cups of coffee out of habit before remembering, and that was how you knew. The puppy had no name when Marsh brought him home. Dr. Nakamura, the vet in Tofino, had said he was part German Shepherd, part something else she couldn't confidently identify. Maybe a bit of husky, she'd said, tilting her head at the animal like he was a crossword clue. Maybe a bit of whatever felt like running away. She smiled at her own joke. Marsh did not, but he didn't disagree. He put the puppy in a cardboard box lined with an old flannel shirt, set the box by the wood stove, and stood looking at it for a while. The puppy looked back. He had one brown eye and one eye that was blue going on gray, which gave his face a permanently quizzical expression, as though he was always on the verge of asking a question he hadn't quite figured out how to phrase. Marsh fed him every 4 hours that first week, setting his alarm the way he used to set it on operations. No snooze, no negotiation. He didn't name him right away. Naming felt like commitment, and commitment felt like the kind of optimism he'd stopped trusting. But on the 8th night, the puppy began to talk. That's the only word for it, really. He didn't bark. He made sounds, low, earnest, conversational sounds, with his head tilted and his mismatched eyes fixed on Marsh's face, as though he was working through something complicated and needed a second opinion. Marsh was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold, and he looked at this 8-week-old animal, voicing opinions about the general state of things at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night. And he felt something move in him that he hadn't expected. He almost smiled. He caught it before it fully formed, the way you catch a door before it blows open, but it had been there. He'd felt it. He called him grit. not for any dramatic reason. It was the word that came to him when he looked at the dog. The way Grit had refused the prognosis, had come back from that first night with both eyes open, and that crooked ear standing at something approaching attention and an appetite that seemed to exceed his own body weight. It was the right word. Marsh was a man who believed in calling things what they were. Grit grew, not quickly but persistently, which was, Marsh thought, the more respectable kind of growth. By October he could navigate the porch steps without incident. By November he had learned that the ocean was very large and somewhat negotiable, but only if you committed fully, a lesson he demonstrated at every available opportunity. By December he weighed 40 pounds and had figured out that if he sat directly on Marsh's feet, Marsh was less likely to stand up and leave the room. He was wrong about this, but Marsh let him believe it for a while. The sounds continued. If anything, they expanded. Grit had developed what could only be described as a range. There was the short, urgent sound that meant there is a bird on the porch railing and I have opinions about this. There was the low, rolling sound that meant I am content, but I want you to know I am content, because acknowledgement matters. And there was the long, wavering sound, almost a song, that Marsh heard most often in the early evenings, when the light came through the kitchen windows at that particular angle that made everything look like the last of something. Marsh didn't know what the evening sound meant. He wasn't sure he wanted to. He had not told anyone about the dog. There was no one particularly to tell. His sister in Halifax sent a text every few weeks. "How are you?" And he replied fine and she replied okay, and that was the relationship in its current form. He had one friend from his SEAL team, a man named Terrence, who was now running a guide service in northern BC, and who called twice a year, once on Marsh's birthday, and once for no particular reason, which Marsh respected. His neighbors were half a kilometer in either direction. He had a standing arrangement with a man named Dale at the hardware store in Port Alberni, which consisted entirely of Dale ordering things for Marsh and Marsh picking them up without making much conversation, and both of them finding this perfectly satisfactory. This was his life. He had organized it carefully, the way you organize a space you intend to stay in. He hadn't done it out of grief, exactly, or not only out of grief. He'd done it because after 15 years of operating in conditions, specifically designed to strip a human being down to essentials, he had come home to find that he didn't actually know what he needed anymore, and this, the quiet, the coast, the cold mornings and the old-growth trees, seemed like the right place to figure it out. He was still figuring it out. Then Grit got into the truck. It was late January, a morning that smelled of frost and fir needles, and Marsh had driven into Ucluelet for groceries. He was certain he had left Grit in the cabin. He remembered closing the door. He remembered the sound of it latching. What he had not accounted for was the window above the kitchen sink, which he had left open 2 inches for ventilation, and which was apparently exactly 2 inches more than a 4-month-old dog, with strong convictions about separation anxiety, required to rethink his situation. Marsh discovered this when he reached into the back of the truck for his grocery bag, and found Grit sitting among his work gloves, looking deeply pleased with himself. Marsh stood there in the parking lot of the co-op grocery store and looked at the dog for a long moment. "You came through the kitchen window," he said. It was not a question. Grit made a sound. It was the sound that meant I see no reason to relitigate this. A woman walking past slowed down involuntarily and looked at the dog. She was maybe 60, with the kind of weathered warmth you see in people who've spent decades close to the water, rough at the edges, but nothing harsh underneath. She had a tote bag from the library. "Is he talking to you?" she said. "He talks to everyone," Marsh said, "whether they ask or not." The woman laughed. It was a real laugh, not a polite one, and it carried in the cold air the way good sounds do. She kept walking, still smiling. Marsh looked at Grit. Grit looked back with his mismatched eyes and tilted his head slightly to the left, as though waiting for the other man to admit what they both already knew. Marsh put the groceries in the truck. He did not put Grit out. Winter on the coast is not like winter anywhere else. The light goes early and the rain is not dramatic about it. It just arrives and stays, the way a relative does when they've stopped making plans. The ocean in January is the color of pewter and about as inviting, and the wind off the Pacific has the particular quality of having crossed nothing but open water for 1,000 kilometers. and arriving with something to say about it. Marsh didn't mind. He'd been cold in places that made this look like an inconvenience. He had a good wood stove and enough firewood, and Grit, who had by February developed the habit of sleeping pressed against Marsh's legs on the narrow couch. Not at his feet, not nearby, but directly adjacent, with the specific intention of being touching at all times. Marsh told himself this was a canine thermoregulation strategy. But on the hard nights, when the wind was loud enough to fill the cabin, and the silence that lived inside the wind was louder still. The kind of silence that had a shape, that was made of the space where Juno's voice used to be. Marsh would lie there in the dark and feel the steady warmth of the dog against him, and something would unclench, fractionally, in the place where he had been holding everything very tightly for a very long time. He didn't tell anyone this either. But he stopped setting the alarm for 2 in the morning. He'd been setting it for 3 years, for no reason he could justify in daylight. He just stopped. In March, a man arrived at the cabin. Marsh heard the truck before he saw it. An older F-150, the exhaust a bit rough, coming slow down the logging road the way people do when they're not sure they've taken the right turn. He was on the porch with his coffee when it pulled up, and he recognized the driver, and he felt the specific tension of someone prepared to be complicated. The man who got out was called Gordon Spares. Gordon was 61, wide across the shoulders, with a white beard he'd grown in retirement, and kept badly trimmed, and white hair that had decided its own direction. He'd been Marsh's chief petty officer for 9 of Marsh's 15 years. He'd also been the man who'd called Marsh the night Juno died, and sat on the phone without saying much for a long time, which was more than most people had managed. He hadn't visited in 2 years. He was from Nanaimo, which was technically not far, which meant the not visiting had been deliberate. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked at Marsh. Then he looked at Grit, who had materialized at Marsh's side and was now assessing Gordon with the intense professional seriousness that was apparently Grit's default mode when strangers came close to Marsh. "When did you get a dog?" Gordon said. "He got me," Marsh said. "There's a difference." Gordon came up the steps. Grit allowed it. This was, Marsh noted, not given freely. Grit moved aside with a certain quality of supervision, like a security detail that had decided to stand down but wanted the newcomer to know the option existed. They sat at the kitchen table with coffee. Gordon turned his mug in his hands the way he always had when he was working up to something. "Your sister called me," he said finally. "I figured. She's worried. She says that to everyone. She said you haven't been out of this place in. I go to town, to the grocery store. Groceries are essential." Gordon looked at him. It was the look that had once preceded mission briefings, when Gordon was organizing information in a specific order designed to produce a specific result. Marsh had admired it professionally. He found it less welcome domestically. "I'm fine, Gordon. You're living alone on a logging road talking to a dog." He starts most of the conversations. As if to demonstrate, Grit looked at Gordon and made a sound. It was the low, measured sound, the one that meant "I am observing and I have not yet decided." Gordon stared at him. "Did he just—" "He has things to say," Marsh said. "I've stopped trying to moderate it." Gordon looked at the dog a moment longer. Then, slowly, something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but its honest precursor. He shook his head. "What do you feed him?" "Whatever Dr. Nakamura tells me to." "You have a vet." "He has a vet. I'm administrative support." Gordon did smile then. It was small and real, the kind you can't manufacture, and Marsh looked away from it because some things are easier to let pass. They talked for 2 hours. Not about Juno, not directly, not yet. They talked about Gordon's boat and the weather off Nanaimo, and the state of the highway between there and here, and a man they'd both served with who had opened a brewery in Kelowna, and whether that was going well. Which Gordon thought yes, and Marsh had no information on. They talked the way men who have been through things together talk when they're being careful, circling the important things, keeping them in view without approaching directly. But at some point, Gordon said, quietly, without turning it into a production, she would have liked him. Juno. She would have called him ridiculous, and then she would have talked to him more than anyone. Marsh was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. Grit was sitting between them. He'd been mostly quiet, which was unusual, but there was something in the room he seemed to understand. Some texture of the silence, and he'd adjusted himself accordingly, the way he did. Now he looked at Marsh, and then at Gordon, and then he made the evening sound. The long one. The one Marsh heard when the light went sideways and the day was finishing. Gordon looked at the dog for a long moment. "What does that one mean?" he said. "I don't know," Marsh said honestly. "Does it feel like something?" Marsh picked up his coffee cup, put it down again. "Yeah," he said. "It does." Gordon stayed 3 days. This was not planned, or not openly planned, but by the end of the first afternoon it was clear that Gordon had not expected to leave quickly, and Marsh had not decided to make him. They fell into a rhythm. Coffee in the morning, work in the afternoon, Marsh splitting wood and Gordon, with no prompting, rehanging the gate that had been dragging since November. They ate simply. They didn't talk constantly. This was something they'd always been able to do, to share a space without filling it, which is a rarer skill than most people credit. Grit supervised everything. He had decided, apparently through some internal process neither man was privy to, that Gordon was acceptable, not entirely trusted. There were certain spots on the property where Grit would position himself between the two men, with an air of mild professional concern, but acceptable. He followed Gordon around with what could only be described as supervisory interest, monitoring the gate hanging with his head tilted and his mismatched eyes tracking every movement. At one point, Gordon looked down at him and said, "Are you evaluating my work?" Grit made a short, decisive sound. "He says yes," Marsh said from behind the woodpile. "And I don't know. He hasn't told me the result." Gordon looked at the dog. The dog looked back. Then Grit moved 2 steps to the right and sat down, which Gordon chose to interpret as approval. On the second evening after dinner, they sat on the porch as the dark came in off the water. The trees were barely visible at the edge of the clearing, just darker shapes against a dark sky. The night smelled of rain coming, though it hadn't started yet. Grit was on the step below them, facing out toward the tree line with the attentiveness of a sentry who found the assignment genuinely interesting. Gordon said, "When's the last time you called anyone just to talk?" Marsh thought about it. "Terrence, maybe 6 months back. Not your sister. She texts." "That's not the same." Marsh didn't answer. "I'm not here to tell you how to grieve," Gordon said. "I wouldn't know how. I never lost what you lost." He paused. "But I'm here to say that being alone in a cabin for 4 years isn't the same as being okay, and I think you know that." The rain started, very lightly, just a sound in the trees at first, then a feeling on the backs of their hands. "I know that," Marsh said. So I don't know what comes after it." Gordon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Maybe you don't need to know. Maybe you just need to start moving and figure it out from there." Grit turned around from his post on the step. He looked at Marsh directly, with those mismatched eyes, and then made the sound. The long one, the evening one. And Marsh felt the familiar unclench, the fractional release of something held too long in the same position. He sat there in the rain beginning, with the dog on the step, and the old man beside him, and the trees standing the way they'd always stood, and he thought about what it would mean to start moving. Not to have it figured out. Not to know the destination. Just to pick up and go, the way Grit had come through the kitchen window. Not because it made sense, but because staying still had become the less acceptable option. "I got a letter from the Regional Veterans Center in Victoria," Marsh said, "a while back. They're looking for someone to do peer support. Outreach, mostly. Veterans who are isolated." Gordon didn't say anything. He waited. "I've been not answering it for 3 months. How long does it take to write a reply?" "About 10 minutes. "And how long have you been not writing it?" 3 months. Gordon nodded slowly. "You could take the dog." Marsh looked at Grit. "He'd have opinions," Marsh said. "He seems to always have opinions." "They're usually relevant," Marsh said, and heard, as he said it, that it was true. He wrote the letter the next morning, before Gordon's truck had cleared the end of the logging road. It wasn't a complicated letter. It said he was interested and available, and that he had specific experience with isolation that he thought might be useful, and that he was willing to come to Victoria to discuss. He printed it at the library in Ukulele. Janet raised her eyebrows at the printer warming up, because he'd never used it before, and he drove it to the post office and he mailed it. Grit waited in the truck. When Marsh came back, Grit was sitting in the driver's seat. "That's my seat," Marsh said. Grit made a sound that suggested this was a matter of perspective. Marsh moved him gently to the passenger side. Grit spent the first 10 minutes of the drive home pressed against Marsh's arm with what could only be described as enthusiasm, and then settled into his customary position with his chin on the dashboard, and his mismatched eyes watching the road unroll ahead of them through the firs. The reply from the Veterans Center came 2 weeks later. They wanted to meet. They asked if Thursday would work. Marsh had not had a scheduled Thursday in 4 years. He had not had anywhere to be at any specific time, for any reason that involved other people in longer than that. He sat with the letter and thought about what it would feel like to drive down to the ferry, to cross the water, to sit in a room with people who were also trying to figure out what came after the thing they'd survived. He thought about Juneau. He thought about her the way he always did. Not the end of it, but the middle of it. The ordinary Tuesday evenings, when she'd sit across the table from him and laugh at something he'd said and fill the room with it. He thought about how she had always said that the bravest thing wasn't the thing you did when the situation demanded it. It was the thing you chose when nothing was making you. "I'm going to say yes," he told Grit. Grit looked at him. Then Grit made a sound. Short, decisive, unambiguous. The sound that meant, as near as Marsh could translate it, obviously. The drive to the ferry at Nanaimo was 3.5 hours in clear weather, and Grit spent most of it conducting an ongoing commentary on everything they passed. The trucks on the highway, the rest stop outside of Parksville, where Marsh let him out for 10 minutes, the seagulls at the ferry terminal who had the audacity to exist in the parking lot. He was not aggressive about any of it. He simply had things to say, and he said them, and when Marsh acknowledged them, a word, a hand, a look. Grit would settle briefly before some new development demanded his attention. The ferry worker at the loading ramp glanced into the truck when they pulled forward. "Nice dog," she said. "He thinks so too," Marsh said. She smiled. It was the automatic smile of someone who says the same thing to 200 vehicles, but it lingered slightly, the way things sometimes do when they catch a corner of something real. Victoria was greener than he remembered and louder than the island, which is not a high bar, but it felt like one. He found the Veterans Center on a side street behind a community garden, a low building with cedar siding and a hand-lettered sign by the door. He sat in the truck for a minute before going in. Grit looked at him. "I know," Marsh said. "I'm going." He wasn't talking to himself. That was the thing. He'd stopped being able to say, honestly, that he was talking to himself. Inside, there was a man at the front desk named Paulette. He'd assumed from the email that Paulette was a woman, and stood corrected without incident, who had the efficient warmth of someone who'd done intake long enough to know what the face across from him needed before the person knew it themselves. He gave Marsh a form. He brought him a coffee without asking. He looked at the truck through the window and said, "Is that your dog?" "He's his own dog," Marsh said. "I'm just part of his support network." Paulette laughed. "Can he come in?" "Probably better if he doesn't. He has a lot to say, and the acoustics in here look good." He met with a woman named Sandra Firth, who ran the outreach program and had a handshake like a sergeant, and the patience of someone who had sat across from a great number of men who did not know how to ask for what they needed. She asked him good questions. She did not ask the ones that would have made him leave. She talked about the work, the phone calls, the home visits, the men and women who were doing exactly what Marsh had done, which was to organize their lives into smaller and smaller spaces and call it fine. "It's not complicated work," she said, "but it has to be done by people who know what the silence sounds like from inside it." Marsh thought about the cabin. He thought about the alarm he'd set every night for 3 years. He thought about the 2 cups of coffee. "I know what it sounds like," he said. "I thought so," she said. "When can you start?" He drove back to the ferry with the sun going sideways in the way it does on the island, turning the water into something almost too bright to look at. Grit had his chin on the dashboard and his eyes half closed against the light. Marsh had the window down an inch and the cold off the Strait of Georgia was coming in, clean and salt-sharp, the kind of air that doesn't apologize for being cold. He thought about Gordon on the porch, in the rain starting, just start moving. He thought about Juneau. He thought about how she used to say, and she'd said it about everything, about her patience, about the hard shifts, about him, that you can't wait until you're ready. Ready is something that happens while you're going, not before. He reached over and put his hand on Grit's back. Grit lifted his head and looked at him with those mismatched eyes, one brown, one blue going gray, and made the long sound. The evening one. The one Marsh had stopped trying to interpret and started trying to just hear. The sun was going down over the water, and the ferry was somewhere ahead of them in the last of the light. And there was a Thursday now, which was more than there had been 2 weeks ago, and Grit was talking in the passenger seat, in the way he always talked, as though the world was interesting and had things to say if you were paying attention. Which it turned out, it did. The only thing left was to listen.